So we're here on the occasion of these two exhibitions that are concurrent. One is Ethan Ryman's here at Cathouse Proper, which is where I'm the director. And then Tom McGlynn is at Rick Wester Fine Arts in Chelsea. And the idea was Tom McGlynn, who was at Ethan's opening. We had a good conversation, and Tom got excited enough at least to write a review for Brooklyn Rail. So Ethan visited Tom's show and they had a good conversation over there. So we thought maybe to make that conversation public. And that's what the Zoom event is ultimately for. So we appreciate you coming. And Tom shows up through June 30th.
Correct.
At what's the address over there, Tom?
The address of Rick Wester Fine Arts is 526 West 26th Street on Suite 417. So it's on the fourth floor, right as you go in the fourth floor on the right.
And Ethan Ryman's show titled New Work is at Cathouse Proper through June 11th, which is next Sunday. And then Ethan, maybe you want to explain that the show will remain up. Is that true?
Well, the show will remain hung, and it will be available for visits, appointments.
Right. So they'll be through the summer.
Since my studio is in the same building, we'll probably have an event or two, open studio type event too. So yes, you can, after June 11th, you can still make an appointment to see the work.
Ethan, I'm going to suggest that David Rhodes, who's the second for Tom McGlynn, who's in Tom McGlynn's space with Ethan, get on the camera, see that you have for the room shot, like I'm sitting here like this. You think we can get David over there?
Yeah, I guess
so we have a nice kind of symmetry here with
your camera,
with the setup. So maybe forego the use of the camera on the phone and just have a seat there with the stable video. That's what I would suggest. And then we'll start the talk here. Okay. But the set up, and we got Tom McGlynn is in Ethan's show here in Brooklyn, and Ethan is in Tom's show in Manhattan. And then each is going to speak about both their shows and the other people.
Rather than roam around with the
okay, so you guys ready to go? Tom, you want to take it off? Because well, the Brooklyn Rail review just came out today at around noon, and there you go. Thank you, David. David, you want to introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are here in this little conglomeration we have?
Sure. I'm an artist. I make paintings, abstract paintings, and I'm also editor at Margin Brooklyn Rail.
Your audio is, we can't hear you, David.
Oh, we got to unmute.
That's
Yeah, we might get echo if he goes on, if he talks. Okay, so without further ado here, let's go. David, if you have any questions, I mean, if we're going to jump into conversation, we're going to let Ethan and Tom have it out, and we'll be here to sort of support and ask questions because David knows Tom's work very well, and I know Ethan's work well, having worked with him as a partner here at Cathouse Proper for the last 6 years. So this culminates my program at Cathouse Proper, which has always been at 524 Projects, which 524 Projects is Ethan's program. So I'm concluding by curating Ethan into basically his own space that he designed, hence why it seems to be so perfectly fit into the environment, the work. It speaks to the space around, which Tom mentions in his review. So maybe that's a good place to start. I don't know, Tom.
Well, David, would you, I think it would be interesting for me to just take a quick walkthrough. Can I do that with my laptop?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good solution. Yeah.
Yeah, let me do that because there's a kind of a long shot of my show, but I want to give Ethan a little filling here. So just bear with me as I do this. Because I can't see where I'm pointing this, so But you can see the space. It's a very eccentric space. And what I wrote in the review is that Ethan is definitely responding to the eccentricity of the space, which he also designed. So there's a lot of correlation here with the architectural design and the models that Ethan photographs and then that Ethan fabricates and then photographs. So the work is actually not the model, it's the photograph of the model. So as you can see, these are close-ups. You can see some of the painterly aspect of the close-ups, I hope. And here's a light box. So the impression of these pieces, initially, I think when I saw Ethan's work, I got the impression of like formalist work or work that was, you know, formalist abstraction. But there's something very quirky about this oblique situating of these photographs. And once one discovers that they're photographs, then it takes on a whole different meaning, because like I said in the review, it's, and you know, I apologize for this kind of awkward walkthrough, but like I said in the review, the distancing of the photography in conjunction with the models, which are painted very painterly, creates this really interesting tautological situation where you're, and because the photographs are very intensely high def, you know, with this really incredibly high definition Hasselblad camera, you can see all the detail, all the painterly detail. So initially the work presents as if it's painted. Actually, when I first saw the show, I didn't know that some of these weren't painted. Like I assumed some of them were painted. So there's an interesting kind of presentational withdrawal thing going on, which I thought was interesting. And in the review, I correlated it with a contemporary idea of proximity and distance, like a simultaneous proximity of distance, say like in a Zoom, like we've become familiar with during COVID. So those were the points that I made in the review. But I had a lot of time to kind of, I've been thinking about this for like 3 weeks, so I've had a lot of time to digest all of that. And you know, as you can see between our shows, there is a similarity in, you know, a superficial similarity in the formalist aspect, which is why I assume David Dixon called this abstraction squared. But I think, you know, I don't know. What do you think, Ethan?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's similar trajectories in our approach to making art, and one of the things I've noticed is the this sort of malleability of space, where I love it when you have a situation where as an art viewer, you're in charge. You decide what's going on. If you think something is a painting, it's a painting. If you think it's a drawing, it's a drawing. If you think something's coming out, it's coming out. If it's going in, it's going in. You know, Tom's rectangles, when you get very close to them, you know, you can stand next to your friend and, you know, I can think that it's indented, and he can think that it's a relief. And we could both be right. And that's why these square, these shapes have this floating effect, is because of this sort of malleability. And you know, I love these sort of choices in perception.
Yeah, I think the term I used in my review is indeterminism.
Bring some rice to serve.
Oh, thank you. I meant to do it.
Lisa, I think your mic is on. Yeah, so no, that's true, Ethan. The term I used in reviewing your show was indeterminacy, which is, kind of the same thing as malleability on,
Yeah.
it depends on how you slice that, but maybe David Rhodes wants to jump in.
So I was wondering about the role of color in Tom's work, actually, and I was thinking that with Ethan's work, there's very much a combination of image and object without synthesizing. They're both present. And it's, as you were saying, it's very curious how the two aspects are in flux. So maybe the image is seen as a painting initially. The objects advance into the room and they also recede as photographic space. But in your case, it's the language of color that achieves this spatial aspect.
Oh, God.
I was wondering how you feel about the role of color in establishing space. And it's very clear in your work that it's a painting, but
Nice. Yeah, it's just a nice.
both have an ambiguity. There's
Nice.
neither works are static in the sense that they both use different languages to have a recursive visual experience with very different physical presences. So,
But excuse me, David, I just wanted to tell Lisa Hine, your mic is on. So if you can mute your mic, that would be helpful.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Honest mistake. But I'd like to respond to what David said about the lack of synthesis, which is interesting because the imperative to synthesize, that can become like a philosophical question, but I think it's an interesting statement because if I'm hearing you right, David, that there isn't the necessity for there isn't an imperative to synthesize the distance between the photograph and the painting. And I think it's interesting to me because that also, it's not all wrapped up, it's not something that's all wrapped up and solved. And so that also lets the viewer decide. The viewer can synthesize
right.
the work.
In,
I don't know what you were saying about color. I didn't quite get that, David. I'm sorry.
I was wondering what how you approach this use of color. Do you have a plan for the colors? Initially, when you're making the painting, do you have a plan for the colors and the size of the rectangles, the number of rectangles? How do the paintings become in that sense?
Well, it probably sounds like an inadequate answer, but it's all intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
But the process that I set up, I think, allows me to be intuitive. There's an aspect of like the archive, and there's the aspect of like sampling, and there's an aspect of like my previous work, which was sampling from pop culture. So some of the palette comes from like internalizing all of those palettes that I used to work with. But I did this interesting experiment once where, when I was working from specific sources, like, not from just like, color theory, but like from drawing it from representational sources. And I said, you know, I'm going to make a palette from all these sources, and that'll be my palette. You know, that's what I'll work with because that'll represent my sources. You know, but the interesting thing that happened was that when I made this palette with these sources divorced from the sources, they just became like a set of colors. They come like the representational reference was just completely lost. So it was kind of an important lesson because I was like, wow, it's not important. You know, that the colors are going to demand their own space and you know, they have their own kind of, they're kind of very intransigent. So
What I've noticed was I mean, this is really so much about the color, but the texture in each of these rectangles is slightly different, and some of them there's no discernible texture at all, and they become just a void, and others have paint strokes and other things going on, and it's interesting that the spacing of the rectangles is the way they are also. And you know, when I first saw the show, these are so meditative and detailed. You know, there's a lot of things hidden in these paintings, and it struck me as strange that there were so many paintings in such a small space. But then I realized after seeing David Dixon, back if you saw the show, and I said, yeah, I thought there were so many paintings in this little room, and he pointed out that that it was very similar to what happens in the compositions, because if you look at these rectangles, and, you know, you can't look at one in isolation. They all are affecting each other, and so those subtle differences are there in the corners of your eyes, and the same effect happens when I saw the show today. The same effect happens with this hanging, and now I sort of really understand this hanging because it has that same effect. You know, you can't look at one of these paintings in isolation in this gallery, and it's an interesting situation.
yeah, I have to thank Rick Wester for the installation. He's very sensitive to color. We were concerned about you know, the number of paintings and but you know, and that also, thanks for your observation. I think the way I paint is kind of, it is kind of very meditative because I use very thin layers, and I paint, you know, like maybe 9 layers or something. It doesn't look like it because they're very thinly painted, so the water they're acrylic, so the water evaporates. But there are still these striations that are, which you can see when you see them in person. So so the process of painting is very, it's a very kind of, it is a meditative thing, because I have to hold the brush in a way parallel to the surface. They're painted on the table. I have to hold the brush parallel to the surface, almost like I'm raking like a Zen garden, you know. And so like it's kind of like it's a real feat of brinksmanship for me in the studio, because I have to keep that kind of flow going without it breaking, because if it breaks, then the surface tension kind of breaks, you know. And then so yeah, that's a really important part. Sometimes in reproduction they don't really, the brushstrokes don't show, but
Well, I think that's a sign of success if your work doesn't reproduce in photographs very well.
Whereas what you're doing is actually you're subsuming that whole thing. You're subsuming. I think there's a lot of wit in your work in terms of visuality, because you're subsuming the role of like the photography doing that, but at the same time they're like so physically present. The way you install the work and the way you're looking at it in an obtuse angle obtuse or acute angle, it refutes the distance of the photograph. So it's interesting, you're addressing it like in the opposite direction somehow.
Yeah, I consider it realism. It looks like art, but it really is just very simple. I'm not a painter, but I can compose with paint.
What I thought was interesting though, like if again, people see the work in person, the intensity of the Hasselblad, I forget the number, but like it's a very high definition camera. It shows how painterly the models are, like the actual sculptures that you photograph. So like they're not sloppy, but they're very kind of like painted with brio.
Yeah, that's something that's one of the things that I really have been concentrating on is our perception of perfection and everything is about all of my thinking is about that, what's flat and what's not, and what's straight and what's not, and what's doing what, and how is it important, and so that consideration is very important. Those choices.
Yeah, so you should tell everybody what the title of your sculptures are, because I think that's very insightful. Like that'll give people insight into what you just said.
Yeah, they're called perfect flat constructions, and the reason I titled it that is because I like to have these conversations about what's perfect and what's flat, and so the sort of painterly aspect that comes through in these is because I'm trying to get to a place where I love this sort of proximity effect of things being perfect. If you step far away from something, it can seem flawless because you're not getting all of the details. And so I like this duality of something that looks razor sharp and perfect, but then when you look at it, it's not, it's all fucked up. It's, the lines aren't straight, nothing's and that, I think that echoes the universe is like that. What we're seeing all the time is not really what's going on. I mean, the things that are static are really moving, and if they're heated up, they're moving very violently. And the things that we think of as straight are actually very jagged. And a lot of these things have to do with proximity. And so I use that in creating situations where you can go both ways. It can be flat or it cannot be flat. It can be straight, it cannot be straight. It's up to you. The viewer is the ultimate power.
I've heard this, it's interesting, I've heard this referred to rhetorically in writing about art as an aporia, or as paradoxical. Like there's a paradoxical occupation of the artist to kind of present a world and some ostensibly like a specific object, it has some relation to the world, right? But I think that the artists that I find fascinating are the ones that are kind of very consciously aware of this kind of aporia, this paradoxical aspect of the presentational mode.
I don't know this word, but emporia?
Aporia just means a paradoxical situation, like just the way you described it much more eloquently.
Hey, Ethan, you want to talk about obstructivism, or the way you talk about that theory of yours about obstructionism?
Yeah, I started making photographs when I first started making these things. I started making photographs on the street, which I call convergences, which are the reason they're called convergences is because they're pictures of buildings and things. So they're convergent planes and structures. And so yeah, there's this duality again, where I call them convergences because of those convergent planes and structures, but also because there's a convergence of two conceptual situations. There is, you can look at pictures, these things that I have online, Titan of Leisure type things, and you can look at those and say, okay, well, this is a building, and there's another building behind that building. So that's a like a navigational look. You know, you're assessing the space in front of you, you know, to understand where things are, so you don't bump into anything. But when you crop it and you present it as, you know, just a flat abstraction, you have this duality. So you still know that you're looking at a building and there's another building behind it, but now the situation has changed, and now it doesn't matter what's behind something or what's in front of something. It's just there's a section of this and a section of that, and that's basically what you have in you know, various geometric abstraction, color field painting, and so that's a different situation. That's a good example of sometimes it's more important what something is, and sometimes it's more important what it looks like. So those are those two situations, and the Titan of Leisure things are what led to this exploration with sculptures and photographs.
So it went from a real world photographic condition to one that you basically set up
Yeah,
for yourself.
yeah. I mean, you know, it was basically just sort of noticing things, which is what artists do, and then, you know, making conclusions and then having fun with it.
And questioning perception, I'd assume.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said, you know, what we perceive is kind of seems very specific to us, and maybe even to what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, if you're crossing the street, your view of that street is going to be about crossing the street because you don't want to get hit by a car, and you know, maybe that guy over there is crazy or whatever. That's one way to look at it. If you're looking at that same street in a photograph in a gallery, you know, that's a whole different situation. Then you're noticing different things. You're noticing, oh, well, you know, that lamp post on the side is got a dent in it that, you know, looks like the Virgin Mary or something. You know, I don't know. You look at, it's a different situation.
I know you don't like the term artifice in relation to art.
Well, not with my art, just because I feel like, I mean, I'm not trying to fool anybody. I mean, what you have is what you have. I mean, like we were talking to Tim Mall the other day in the space, I said, you know, I'm not trying to confuse you, but I am going to make a situation where you may become confused. but that's not me. I mean, that's the universe does that too. I mean, the universe is a place where you might be confused too. So I'm not, you know, trying to trick anybody or anything. I mean, you know, photographs of sculptures or photographs of sculptures. But then from there, you as the viewer take it wherever you want. You want to think of it as a painting, fine. You know, you think of it as a construction, yeah, okay. Is it flat? Fine. Not flat, great.
But when you frame those photos, you intentionally confuse what's in front and what's behind, and create continuations that are just visual but not actual in relation to the three-dimensional object you're photographing, right?
True. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, you know, we are talking about objects, you know, based on other objects. So there is this sort of meta object thing going on there. And yeah, I have as much fun with it as possible.
So there's a kind of trompe l'oeil going on, I always feel like, in your work.
Yeah, sure. In a way. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, although, you know, I'm not trying to make a, you know, brick look like wood or wood look like stone. I'm giving it to you as it is.
I also think, you know, like I made the point when I wrote about your work, Ethan, that I differentiated it from artists like James Cassabere or Thomas Demand, who also made, you know, they make models and they photograph them and that becomes their work. Because some of the subtext of their work is simulation, you know, some of the subtext of their work is about like falseness or that assumption, but I really don't think that's an aspect of your work at all.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think so either. No.
It's uncanny and it's frank withdrawal. You know, it's withdrawal I don't know. It's very interesting that the tension is in your method as well as like the literal compositions. You're setting up this, so.
Yeah, I don't know, Ethan, if this is where I drop my my personal insight into your work that I love so much. Because right, there's the method, the way that, I don't know if this is made clear because I was running around letting people in and everything, but that Ethan sets up these reliefs and then photographs them. And then from those reliefs, which are kind of the mothers, there's a whole multiplicity of reproductions that can be used from that. So there's kind of two orders of being in the work that you do, because the reliefs that you make are also sculptures that can exist on their own. Unlike maybe Thomas de Man, who I think throws away the model. You never see the model. So your model is actually still a thing that you consider an art object, and then you photograph that art object and you get multiples from that original in a way. But you know, and I knowing you and your past history as a recording studio artist, I've always saw the setup, especially because we did a show called The Band, where you're miking the objects, which are the sculpture or the band, and you're using the camera like a recording engineer might use a microphone. And interestingly, in the studio setup, you have the sound stage and then you have a recording booth. So I always think of the mothers, the band, or the original objects as being the ones that are in the sound stage, and the mixing booth is where we get the tracks. So the work that we see in the studio or in the gallery here are kind of the tracks that are mixed from the recorded originals. Now, this is something we've talked a lot about, and I'm not even sure if you really accept that, but
it's certainly not something I ever think about, but I can't argue with any of that. No, I think that's true.
so that's where I don't feel like it's artifice that it's just that you have this kind of model and method set up. And like you say, you're not trying to necessarily, like when you mix an album, you're not trying to trick anyone that it's real, but it becomes the experience, the recorded album.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You know, that's interesting relation to sampling, you know. There's an aspect of my work when David was asking about the color of sampling, and also this kind of compulsion to index things, you know, archive and index things. And I think that I could make the conceptual leap that actually that is also something that, say, you know, social media and you know, activity on computers is kind of like trained us behaviorally to be like really good at, you know, like picking samples from everything and collating them in this kind of like general way. And I think it's a really, you know, there's so this anxiety about AI these days, and I think it's already kind of happened. You know, I think our behavior has already kind of been trained to a certain extent by, you know, how we use social media, and I find that interesting too. And it's something that I self-consciously think about in my method, even though I'm not necessarily trying to reproduce it. I do think about sampling and a collective unconscious that's been conditioned, as it were, by images. So that there's a second nature that happens in the work. You know, so I'm not actually dealing with simulacra either. I'm not interested in making quotes of modernist painting. It's something else, you know. So I think that's another interesting correlation between myself and Ethan's work. It's probably why I responded to it so strongly. It seems very contemporary to me.
That's one of the things, you know, we called the show Abstraction Squared. So that's one thing I'm curious to hear you both speak about is abstraction today. and working sort of in the shadow of the 20th century's advancements in relation to abstraction and figuration. One thing that I wrote about for a show we had here, Jody Manasevit, who was an abstract painter, was that for her generation, which is y'all's generation, you're sort of liberated from the 20th century's concerns with abstraction, which were always kind of parrying and arguing with or fighting for freedom away from notions of figuration and representation. And those battles have sort of been won. So you're sort of liberated from that polemic. And it seems to me like you kind of can revel now in a kind of liberated, anarchic, daily sort of imaginative exploration. And I guess the question is, because I know it came up, the word meta came up, and Adam Simon had a great review in about Tom's show in Two Coats of Paint, and he used the term meta, minimalist abstraction. So I'm wondering, in the shadows of the 20th century, how you guys self-consciously go forward making abstract, nominally abstract work.
Well, I would say there, one of my realizations, wandering around shooting buildings all the time, is that there is abstraction all around us, all the time. You just have to see it. We're stuck in, like I was saying before, we're sort of stuck in this navigational mindset. We move through space. We don't want to fall down the stairs, and we want to avoid certain things. We want to get hit by a bus, so that we're locked into this perception that's really just about moving and surviving. But actually, there's I think what the Titan of Leisure things have to say is that there's abstraction everywhere. I mean, you just have to see it. You have to get out of that navigational threat assessment mindset and look at things like art. And then all of a sudden, everything is abstract. And I would also say that the way that we see the universe is not abstract to a fault, kind of. Like cosmologists will say, like, okay, well, maybe string theory or something describes a universe that is just a giant amorphous cloud of, vibrating stuff. But the minute a human being looks at a vibrating cloud of stuff, the first thing that we're going to say is, well, that part is different than that part. And the minute you say that, then you've made that first, bifurcation, and then boom, you got all of this. You got, this is separate from that, and the chair is different from the floor, and the hand is different than the foot, and I'm different than you, and all this other stuff, which actually probably is not true. The abstract realm of just there being something here and something there, and maybe they're changing all the time, that's probably a lot more accurate view of the universe than any sort of representational image.
Yeah, I think that's, that was part of the point of Deleuze's difference and repetition, that there's this human compulsion to find edges everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, it's an aspect of, like, they have this experiment where they have a baby crawl over this plexiglass edge, and there's nothing underneath it, but, like, we would just walk across it, but the baby doesn't go because they're afraid they're going to fall. So looking for edges gets projected into looking for difference everywhere, because we got to catch the bus.
Yeah. I love the baby reference, because I always think of the peekaboo situation.
Right.
And like babies have, infants have this, they haven't figured out spatial stuff yet. So when you put that blanket up, you're gone. That's magic. I mean, you're no longer there. And so they don't care. They don't care what's behind something or whatever. You pull that thing up, that's it, you're out. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's probably the beginning of neuroses, actually.
Yeah.
We all are subject to that as babies. This neurosis for difference.
Yeah.
Or anxiety about it,
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I noticed from what you were saying was, that we extrapolate everything, all of our experiences, the images we've seen, everything is extrapolated. So, if I see a square and somebody says, yeah, that's a perfect square, then, that's in the repertoire. And then when I see something else that's may or may not be a square, I know that's square or it's quite possibly square. So I don't know, I play with that in my work a lot, and I see it in your paintings too.
Yeah, I mean, I was writing back and forth with David Rhodes, pursuant to David's question about abstraction, specifically in like 20th century definitions of abstraction versus representation. So I don't know if you want to jump in here, David, with regards to that.
Sure.
We're having a hard time hearing you.
Is he muted?
No, maybe he can come by you, Ethan.
I just muted my thing so that we wouldn't feed back. There we go.
Okay, so
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
yeah. Well, within painting, the idea of representation versus abstract seems exhausted as a binary thing for sure, but it's still an issue for anybody wondering what they're looking at. So with art, the conceit is perhaps that we're looking at something that refers us elsewhere, and that's the key to what it might mean. But in fact, as you've both been describing, the key to what the piece of art might mean is in the work itself. So that doesn't preclude references or allegory, doesn't preclude anything. It's the piece of art is an instance of what we encounter elsewhere. It's just that somebody has put a frame around it and said, you can consider this, and in the language of the thing made, something is revealed, and it's up to the viewer what they discover themselves. It's not a code that the artist has. They're not trying to go back to what I said before, trick anybody. So there isn't a hidden code that can be deciphered. Whatever's projected in the work is there to be discovered or produced by the person viewing, encountering. But in terms of that,
necessarily pulling it, so it's not the artist necessarily pulling their punches. It's not like trying to trick the viewer somehow.
I think that's,
Like it's a scam, That's a popular view.
I think that's relevant in relation to Ethan's notions of the frame, which we talked about in the show. Ethan used to say he hated frames, but then we refined that into, oh, you're fascinated by frames.
Yeah, no, I don't think I ever said I hated frames. But I did actually notice, like the other day I was at Vito Schnabel's gallery looking at what's his name?
Jericho.
And I was thinking to myself, I wonder what those De Kirchhoff paintings would look like if they didn't have like some crazy fireworks show going on around the edge. I mean, it would be a completely different experience. I mean, no, and I don't think I hate frames. I am fascinated with frames because, the transition between one thing to another, it seems, is the root of our whole perceptive thing. that, like I said before, those demarcations of where one thing ends and another thing begins, those transitions are immeasurably important, I think, in visual art. And so I concentrate on that quite a lot. I like to control how one thing transitions to another thing, whether it's whether it's an image contained in a photograph or one object, or whether it's several objects. No matter where you're standing and looking at several things, there's always going to be that transition. And the frame is a transition from the artwork to the wall, or from the artwork to the universe, or whatever. And you can, like everything, you could do that a million different ways. And I just think it's just bizarre to choose to have the transition from a work of art to the universe being some sort of crazy thing that is dancing across the room. but I understand art, from my limited knowledge of art history, I do understand where that sort of comes from, in that rich people would have paintings done of their vineyard or their summer house or whatever, and it was a trophy. I can have this artist to make this painting of my castle or whatever, and it is an amazing object, and I'm gilded with all of this stuff to make it that much more impressive as a trophy. But if you're thinking of it completely visually, like you would in a contemporary context, it just seems like a choice that you should make with some thought.
So in an attempt to kind of field some of the questions in the chat, there is a question from Paul D'Agostino about compositional space and formal relationships, crisp lines and sharp edges, why they're important to us. But I think you just kind of answered that, Ethan, in terms of transitions. So if one makes the transitions explicit, then, I don't know, I want to speak for you, Ethan, but I'm just trying to follow up on what you were saying about transitions and difference, so if we're looking for difference everywhere, we don't see how everything's unified, but to some extent, the artist has to kind of make a decision to make a choice, which is a difference, which takes the art world, takes the artwork into some privileged position, and not high or low, but somehow parallel to one's expectation of like a rock, or like a bus. So I think it's a complicated issue, because I don't know if I don't know. What do you think of that?
It's something that is I feel edges and transitions are almost interchangeable. You can have I would say in the paintings in your show here at Requester, it's these are very finely tuned transitions and very abrupt transitions. So there's a contrast is very strong. But when you get to the edge of some of these paintings, one of the things I really love about the transition from the paint to the support is beautifully done on the edges of these things. I don't know if we can. There's one close by I can show you. Let me see.
Thanks.
So that's the edge of one of Tom's paintings. I don't know if you can see this, but it's very meticulous. That transition between the paint and the support is done with a lot of thought, and that's what I'm talking about. You can, and I think painters are conscious of this all the time. I mean, the edges of paintings are sometimes more interesting than the painting, but that's a good example of a transition, I think, and you can control these transitions in various ways. And when you're dealing with more than one object, and one thing is in front of another thing, then that transition, becomes a little more complicated because, there's different views and things, and it becomes very three-dimensional. But you can still decide, you can make choices as an artist as to what the viewer ends up with when one thing ends and the next thing begins.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, when I teach painting, when I teach my students, I try to let them know that one of the most important things about painting specifically is realizing that it's simultaneously a picture and a thing.
Yeah.
And so it has this weird objecthood because it's both, which goes back to your idea of like paradox. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe this is an old-fashioned idea, but maybe that separation from like a landscape or a rock, which we would never apply the word paradox to, like you don't go on a hike and say, oh, that tree is very paradoxical, But,
Yeah.
but we kind of get into that, like in artwork, like I'm tickled by it, when I come upon it, I'm like, because I've become aware of the contingency of the object. And it also relieves me of the responsibility of taking the artwork too seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a beauty to all of the ways that you can accomplish a view. Like if you want to paint two squares next to each other, there's a lot of ways to do that. If you want to make two squares next to each other happen, there's even more ways to do that. And then there's a lot of maybe different reasons why you would want to put two squares next to each other. So there's that variable also. So all of these things, you get to play with, and that's just, it means that no matter what you're looking at, Carmen Herrera or Stella or Mondrian or whatever, that's the very small tip of a very large iceberg, say. And I think it takes people like you and me and David to push that train a little farther down the tracks.
I don't know, David Dixon, do
Yeah.
you want to open it up to questions?
Yeah. In fact, Sunita, would you like to ask a question? I can unmute you. Are you out there?
I see
Sunita wrote in a question about Dutch 17th century interiors, Ethan. I'm looking forward here. So get yourself ready for that. Huh?
Expertise is, yeah.
Here she is. Hey, Sunita, I'm unmuting you. Ask to start video.
Oh, I need to unmute. Okay.
There you are. Hi.
Hi. Well, I had that experience when looking at your work, is that, the way the camera kind of interfaces between you and the work. And so like when you look at a Dutch, like you're saying, what you see is what you get kind of thing, but you're obviously manipulating, how you're making this, taking the photograph, how you're making the structure, how it's rephotographed. And like in Dutch painting, I feel like, you feel like you're looking into something, you're like tricked into thinking it is exactly how you're seeing it, but it's not. You feel like it's been so orchestrated by the painter when you're looking into these scenes, and you get mesmerized, like with your work, Ethan, like with the detail, like like the fact that you're using a camera that's so, able to capture, and the way that Dutch painter is like great, so able to sort of describe what, the world, whether it's the carpet, in the room, or, the object on the table, or the light hitting the table. So I just feel like there's a strong connection. I don't know if you want to that connection, or it matters to you or whatever, but.
I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's true. Details are, it's very important to create that confusion. But again, that confusion is a universal thing. It's not. I'm not doing it. I'm just sort of letting you into that room, I guess. By the way, I saw your work on Bleecker Street. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you. I guess I had this really palpable experience of being in the room. I know you sort of created that space, and then the way you orchestrated the space with your objects in the room, I just felt like you had really created a room within a room, like it was like the room itself was an object.
Yeah, sure. Again, I wasn't really sort of thinking about that, but yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah.
We have another question from John Disler about,
No, that's Mima.
oh, I'm sorry, Mima.
You want to let her talk? Yeah, maybe she can get in there. Mima.
Computer. And she asks, what's our relation to geometry? Do you think that geometry and straight lines belong to the manufacture world and curves more to the organic one? Why the choice of geometrical shapes? I would say personally that it's kind of a generic decision that allows me to do all this other stuff. And like it minimizes the transitions that I have to make within a painting. So, the minute you include, say, like a circle or a curve with a straight edge, for me, it starts to become representational. That's just me, but conceptually also, I remember something that James Sienna told me about his process where he, I'm sure everybody's familiar with his work, but he'll start with a line and then he'll describe the square. And I was in his studio one day and I was asking him about his process, and he said, we just have this square. This is what we have, So I thought echoing the square of the canvas or whatever the panels that I use was the most direct way to avoid a number of decisions that I felt like would distract from the other things that I wanted to do, which is focus on color and how those choices in color and composition become specific and general simultaneously. I get that was my personal choice, just to simplify things.
Yeah, I think simplicity.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think simplicity is the word, like you said. For me, it's interesting what you said about representation, because I never really thought about that, but I guess there's some truth to that, where curves start to jog all of your visual repertoire into some representational thing. For me, it's a choice really just about keeping it simple. Mathematically, straight lines and right angles are easier to deal with. Parabolic space starts getting really complicated really, really quick. And I'm just not ready for that yet. I may graduate to that at some point, but curves are they're very complicated. I have a hard enough time dealing with the right angles and the straight lines. The other thing that I like about right angles and straight lines, though, is that they're uniquely human in a way of engineering and architecture. When you don't see a lot of right angles in nature. I mean, you can find a few cubic forms, maybe some crystals, but nature doesn't do a lot of straight lines and right angles, and so it makes it uniquely a human sort of unnatural naturalism.
Yeah, I would totally concur with that. There's something that, you become aware that you're addressing other human beings. It's ironic because it's not actually about machine or cubism. It's about addressing another human being. So sometimes you see in this Cezanne painting, you'll see, this like kind of lush green landscape, but then there'll be this like kind of orange square, like stuck right in the middle. That doesn't belong there, It's just a communication between him as a human interacting with the landscape.
Yeah.
It's almost like this, there's something in your eye.
Yeah.
So cubism is not like a translation of nature. It's a human, it's a communication between humans.
Yeah.
I see Adam Simon there. Adam, can you hear us? Adam wrote the review of Tom's show and came up with the term meta minimalist abstraction. I thought maybe he might want to jump in here. Adam,
Okay,
there you are, sir.
I unmuted. I hate to disabuse you of that idea, but the thing about when you write an article, at least for 2 coats of paint, is that you don't choose the head. So it wasn't my term. It was, I think, Sharon Butler's term.
Good to know.
Should I put my video on? Anyway, but I mean, I liked it. I thought it was a great headline for the piece. I'll jump in to say that I'm really interested in this conversation, and I'm way upstate, and I'm really afraid. I mean, I'm really sorry that I'm going to miss Ethan's show because the work looks fantastic, and I think listening to you is really interesting. But maybe I'll do one of those studio visits that you said would be possible after the show is officially over. But it seems to me that a lot of what I'm hearing is almost in the realm of phenomenology, and what I wrote about Tom's work had a much more of a sort of almost social bent. David, I know you read the article. Would you agree with that? I mean, there's that aspect to it anyway. And
Well, you ended with that image of the children of the corn, which is always
yeah, exactly.
like a social stretch.
I knew that was a stretch, and like you like to leave people scratching their heads. But Tom and I have had conversations, many of them over the years. We've actually known each other for a very long time. And I brought up his earlier work in the article, which had definitely a social context to it, socio-political, I would say. And so I was trying to make a bridge between this current body of work and that earlier work. But listening to the conversation, I'm thinking like, well, I don't know. Does it have to do with was I writing about my own concerns, or is that aspect evident in Tom's current work? So, Tom, maybe you can speak to that.
No, I think, and I appreciate you making that bridge of the earlier work because that means I don't have to, because it is in the work, like it is distilled into kind of what I'm doing now, and so there is an aspect of that. There is an aspect of distilling the advertising and consumerism that I was working with back then, kind of, what's known as the commodity critique, and trying to find the language to turn that into a social critique. I mean, I tend to think of most art as political, and I think that attitude in my work kind of went underground, but it's still there. And
Well,
I think it's probably comes under the category of like, taking apart the master's house with the master's tools or something, you know, it's because the work ostensibly looks like, and something you wrote about in your article, it refers to classic classic modernism, like, you know, Distill and Malevich. There is that aspect of like the historical, you know, arc too. So those references they're accurate. But it's just like I was saying with like trying to make a palette out of all these representational sources. Like at a certain point, you know, you can go in with a certain kind of intent, and then what happens in the studio sometimes is completely different. And then you know, the colors and the forms make their own, you know, have their own criteria. So it's that too is a paradox, I think, too, because you can have all that content and intent, and at the same time, the delivery system of that is mutable, it changes, you know. So I mean, I like to think it's much more subtle now and much more subliminal, which was something that I was exploring in those, you know, the advertising theory to begin with, the subliminal seduction. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers my question. And the term distillation or distilling is really apt. I think that, yeah, it's almost like in fact, I think it really is a subliminal aspect to your work. But I'm curious about what Ethan might say about this way of approaching. Would this apply to your work, Ethan, in any way?
I'm trying to understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure.
We're talking about advertising?
Well, no, I mean, yeah, so my earlier work, say like from 15 years ago, I was appropriating advertising signage.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And so the abstractions were derived from excerpts. I mean, this is where it relates to your work. There were cut-ups from those advertising, so they became quasi-abstractions, except that they had this semiotic, semantic aspect to them because there were words in them. But it's very similar to your process in a way, because divorced from the context, it becomes something else completely something else altogether.
Sure, I think there's a similarity in the phenomenon of just sort of people looking at your paintings or my photographs and saying, well, okay, I've seen that, I know what that is, but then upon close inspection, you don't really know what that is. So it draws you in to an extent. It's a place you think you've been, but maybe you haven't.
I love that, because I think the impulse in choosing that top gateway drug, was exactly that there was this immediate familiarity, but then something else has happened, And for me, that's extended into the concept of the generic, and how, we all know what a novel is, because the novel is a genre. So when we pick up a novel, we're assuming that's going to happen. Then if you read a specific novel, you might get taken someplace else altogether. But the reason why you enter into that contract is because you think it's a novel,
How are we doing? Anybody else have any questions out there? We're about an hour into our conversation. I want to apologize for the opening. I messed up our production a little bit, so I hope it wasn't distracting for people at the beginning. But I feel like we got sailing pretty good here now. Anything left unsaid that needs to be said? David, what do you think?
I I could say one last thing. The phenomenological aspect to these things is interesting to me because I just only recently discovered that that's what it was. But I think part of discovering what goes on when you're looking at art is this this realization that nobody really knows what's going on here. And that's my understanding of phenomenology is what's going on here. And nobody knows what's going on here. All we know is that we're not going to get out alive. So that's one of the reasons it's good to look at art.
I think that's a great way to end.
That's good, Ethan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to I want to sincerely thank David Dixon for setting this up. I kind of set it up very quickly and it happened very organically, and it's wonderful when things happen like that. So thank you, David. And thank you to David Rhodes also for participating.
Thank all of you. Yeah, this has been great learning experience.
And I apologize to anybody in the chat who I couldn't get to their questions. It's kind of hard going back and forth, but I tried to as much as possible. I'm
looking one last moment. I don't think that there's any lingering questions that we missed. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
We recorded, so I'll make this available on the cathouseproper.com website. I'm sure Rick will do the same.
Thank
And
you. Everybody have a good summer.
yeah, have a good summer.
Enjoy your summer.
Cool. Now I'll unmute and everyone can, I don't know, clap or do whatever people do at the end of these things. Ask all to unmute. All right. Thank you.
Yay!
Oh, there it is.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I